Hi, I'm Rhiannon Enlil, Experienced Team Lead here at the Sazerac House. The Sazerac House is located on the corner of Magazine and Canal Streets in downtown New Orleans, just steps from the French Quarter. This building was originally constructed in 1860, but for 30 years it was left in disrepair and vacant. The Sazerac Company restored the building, and we opened in October of 2019 as a home place with wonderful event spaces, private tasting rooms, a micro distillery, a retail shop, and 3 floors of a spirited, interactive cocktail experience. Here's a little sneak peek on some of our exhibits featuring the Sazerac Cocktail, the official cocktail of the city of New Orleans. We start our journey here on the 3rd floor of the Sazerac House, where we enter into the 1800s Vieux Carré. Behind me are some exhibits that will introduce you to 2 important concepts. First is apothecaries, or pharmacies. In New Orleans back then were places where pharmacists would take a bunch of botanicals, steep it into alcohol, and then sell it to the general public in the form of tinctures that we know as bitters. One important pharmacist was a gentleman by the name of Antoine-Amédée Péchot, and he would go on to create an iconic brand that is crucial to the story of the Sazerac cocktail. Another concept behind me that is featured is our coffee house culture of New Orleans. See, we had bars and taverns and saloons, but if somebody wanted a sophisticated beverage or a fancy drink, you would go to a coffee house. A coffee house wasn't just for coffee. It was places where you could check your mail, network, conduct business. They were usually in or next to exchanges. And so coffee houses were known as places that you would get refined beverages or cocktails. Now, this is a great moment to pause and talk about that word cocktail and what that means. Today, we know cocktails as any combination of alcoholic beverage. You might go to a bar or restaurant and ask for a cocktail menu. But you see, back in the 1800s, those were called fancy drinks. And under that umbrella, there were different categories of fancy drinks. Everything from fizzes and sours to toddies and swizzles, and cocktails. Cocktails had a definition. It was defined as far back as 1803 as a spirit of any kind, sugar, water, and bitters. So that spirit could really be any kind. It could be rum or brandy or whiskey. Sugar, usually a lump of sugar from a loaf or a brick of sugar that the bartender had. Water, probably from a pitcher of water, just enough to dilute the sugar. Or if you were in a fancy enough place, maybe it was chiseled off from a block of ice. And bitters. Our journey at Sazerac House continues into the bitters experience, where we dive a bit deeper into that crucial ingredient to the story of the cocktail. We've created an interactive apothecary where you can smell raw botanicals, taste bitters, and use touchscreen technology to learn a little bit more about the different raw ingredients that go into bitters. The story of the Sazerac cocktail would not be complete unless we are introduced to Antoine-Amédée Péchot. As I mentioned, he was a pharmacist who was just down the road from the location of the original Sazerac House, and he had originally immigrated to New Orleans as a young child in the early 1800s with his family from Saint-Domingue, which is now modern-day Haiti. By the 1830s, he had become a venerated pharmacist, and he introduced his American aromatic bitter cordial, which we now know simply as Péchot's Bitters. Here in the bitters experience, our distilling team is actually producing Péchot's bitters on site, returning production of this iconic brand to the downtown New Orleans area. In our Sazerac Origins room, we dive a little bit deeper into the story and, well, that word, Sazerac. It actually starts as far back as the 1600s in France as a family name. You see, there was a Sazerac family, and they started producing cognac. A brief note on cognac that'll be important later is that cognac is a spirit distilled from grapes. So the Sazerac family had all these vineyards around their estate, and they started putting all of those grapes together and making their own brand of cognac. The patriarch of the family, Bernard Sazerac, and his son Laurent began exporting that cognac to New Orleans by the 1790s under their family name and their brand name of Sazerac de Forget Fils. Now, this cognac really took New Orleans by storm. Since we were a French colony and we loved our French heritage, almost all French imports were warmly embraced. And this particular brand of cognac had a lot of prestige. There were so many different accounts of wholesalers and shop lists and advertisements letting everybody know that they had this Sazerac de Forget Fils cognac that a particular coffee house or a drinking establishment in New Orleans even changed its name. You see, there was a exchange called Merchants Exchange Coffee House just down the road from where I'm standing. And in 1852, they decided to change their name to the Sazerac House, letting everybody know that if you wanted this prestigious and popular brand of cognac, you could get it at the Sazerac House. Around this same time period, Antoine-Amédée Peychaud takes out an advertisement stating that if you wanted his American Aromatic Bitter Cordial, or his bitters, you could get them at the Sazerac House. So if you remember that definition of a cocktail, right? Spirit of any kind, sugar, water, and bitters. We know that in New Orleans, as far back as 1843, we were drinking some combination of specifically brandy, sugar, water, bitters, and absinthe. But with this advertisement that Peychaud takes out in 1857, we see the introduction of his bitters at the Sazerac House, and these two iconic brands come together and become the formation of the first branded cocktail. By the 1870s, however, the importation of Sazerac de Forget-Fils cognac massively declined due to the Great Wine Blight, or phylloxera epidemic, which was an agricultural disaster that wiped out the grapes of France for almost a generation. If you don't have grapes, you can't make wine. So the Sazerac family had to cease production of their Sazerac de Forget-Fils cognac, and the last shipment was in 1880 to New Orleans to the Sazerac House. Back in New Orleans, the new proprietor of the Sazerac House, a man named Thomas Handy, faced a supply issue. Here was this prestigious establishment with a house cocktail lacking in its namesake brand. Well, Thomas Handy was from Maryland, and Maryland was known for a rye whiskey that had a little bit of sweetness to it thanks to the addition of corn in its recipe. That pre-phylloxera cognac, like Sazerac de Forget-Fils, was known for having a bit of spiciness, a bit of complexity. So Thomas Handy starts bringing in rye whiskey to New Orleans into the Sazerac House and replacing that lacking ingredient with a bit of whiskey. Maybe it was a little bit at first, but eventually by the late 1800s, the house cocktail was entirely a rye whiskey drink. In 1901, the Thomas H. Handy Company patents the name Sazerac, and they begin releasing bottled cocktails. 18 years later, that company changes its name to the Sazerac Company. There's another important ingredient that we'll need to explore as we continue our story of the Sazerac cocktail. As I mentioned, New Orleanians had already embraced this combination of brandy or cognac, sugar, water, bitters, and absinthe. You see, because of our French and Spanish culinary roots, New Orleanians really love those big, bold anise flavors. And so absinthe was a very popular ingredient, especially in our cocktails. You see, inventive bartenders had gotten a little bit bored of those formulas, those templates of fancy drinks, and they started to get a little experimental. Different regions around the country would experiment with things like maraschino or curacao. In New Orleans, we experimented with things like absinthe. So a brief history on absinthe. Its invention is generally credited to the Swiss, but its rise in popularity in France is really what made New Orleans embrace it so much. Now, when the cognac and wine industry started to recover from the phylloxera epidemic, they needed to win back their drinkers. So, from the 1880s through the turn of the century, absinthe suffered a terrible stint of publicity. From a combination of flawed science, the temperance movement, some criminal cases, and its rise in popularity with the poets and bohemians of Paris, absinthe was widely banned. It was even banned in the United States by 1912, 8 whole years before Prohibition. Enter another important character in the story of the Sazerac cocktail, a local by the name of J. Marion Lejeune. Well, he had spent some time in France during World War I and came home with an illicit recipe for absinthe. In the 1920s, he worked through Prohibition as a pharmacist, but in 1933, he released his own New Orleans brand of Lejeune absinthe. It was really popular until suddenly the government steps in and says, no, no, no. Even though Prohibition's been repealed, the ban on absinthe remains in place. So Lejeune tweaks his recipe and re-releases his product as Lejeune Herb Saint. He takes out tons of wonderful billboards informing the drinkers of New Orleans that you're to reach for Herb Saint whenever absinthe is called for. It becomes the local product that New Orleanians reach for when making their beloved Sazerac cocktail. And in 2005, the Sazerac Company launches Sazerac Rye Whiskey as the perfect rye for a Sazerac cocktail. So here we have that iconic name, Sazerac, on a bottle of fantastic rye to combine with sugar, water, Peychaud's bitters, and a rinse of absinthe. In 2008, through the grassroots efforts of some very passionate bon vivants, a campaign was successful in getting the Louisiana legislature to name the Sazerac cocktail as the official cocktail of the city of New Orleans. And now we're gonna go into one of our private tasting rooms where I'm gonna show you how we combine these three iconic brands into the perfect Sazerac cocktail. So here I am in one of the private tasting rooms we have here at Sazerac House. I'm going to demonstrate for you how to make a perfect Sazerac cocktail. You start with 2 glasses. In one, I'm going to add ice and set it aside to chill. In the next glass, I'm gonna add a sugar cube and 3 dashes of Peychaud's bitters. I'm gonna muddle all that up to like a nice paste. I'll take 1.5 ounces Sazerac rye whiskey. I'm gonna add some ice and stir. You wanna stir until all the ingredients are well incorporated, chilled, properly diluted. Take this glass that was chilling and dump out the ice. Add 1/4 ounce of absinthe. Swirl it around your nice chilled glass and toss out the excess. Now I'm gonna strain this mixture of rye whiskey, sugar, and Peychaud's bitters into my chilled absinthe-coated glass. The final touch is a long peel of lemon. Spritz that oil right across the top and coil the lemon, placing it on the side of the glass. And there you have a perfect Sazerac cocktail. Thank you so much for taking the time to go on this little sneak peek of some of the fantastic exhibits that we have here at Sazerac House. We are open to the public, and admission to the exhibit floors is always complimentary. So when you're in New Orleans, please make a reservation and come and check us out. As always, remember to drink responsibly, and we look forward to seeing you in New Orleans. Cheers to you.